Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Donna Martinez. Welcome to the John Locke Foundation, coming to you live from Midtown Raleigh. So glad that you are with us on this Monday. And welcome to National School Choice Week. The John Locke Foundation has been participating in this week for a number of years now. We are honored and proud to be part of this celebration across the country of empowering parents, making sure that kids have more options so that they can get more personalized instruction. Happy to be a part of this. Now, of course, this year things are much different because of COVID-19, and we all know about how badly and negatively that education and kids have been impacted by the COVID situation. You've got kids, many of whom, including lots of kids right here in North Carolina, who have been forced into an online learning environment. Like it or not, whether it works for them or not, that is what a lot of kids are now dealing with. And of course, the parents now have had to become just so close to the education of their kids. And on the one hand, that's been a tremendous strain for a lot of families. On the other hand, it has indeed made sure that parents have never had as much of a tight connection to their kids and their education as they do now in many cases, because they have had to do that because of COVID-19. So what do we do coming out of the pandemic? How do we ensure that that connection, that bond that has been formed, that involvement of the parents in their child's education is strengthened moving forward? Well, we believe in choice here at the John Locke Foundation. One way to do this is to make sure that there are more options. And in fact, today we're going to be talking about some of these things and a specific study that would lead us that way. Joining me today are two of my colleagues here at the John Locke Foundation. Dr. Terry Stoops is the director of the Center for Effective Education, and Dr. Bob Lubke is the senior fellow with the Center for Effective Education. Terry and Bob, thank you. Appreciate you joining us today. We're going to be hearing from each of you a little bit later in the hour. Joining us also is Corey Deangelis. Corey is the director of school choice for the Reason Foundation. He is the author of the recent study that we're discussing today, Funding Students Instead of Systems, the Economic Impacts of Statewide Education Savings Accounts in North Carolina. Yes, this study is about North Carolina in large part. Corey, welcome. So glad to have you with us. So we appreciate you joining us to talk about all of this. It's an exciting week, first of all, National School Choice Week. I know you are a part of this every year as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And it is National School Choice Week, so this is a perfect time to discuss this study about funding students instead of systems. And this is really how I have started to talk about school choice, because when you say school choice, a lot of people don't really know exactly what you're talking about. Is it this or that, the other? But when you get into talking about it in terms of funding students as opposed to systems, or funding students as opposed to institutions, it's more clear about what we're actually talking about. It's definition that I would apply is allowing the children's education dollars to follow them to wherever they're getting an education. That could be the public school. If the public school's system works for them, the individual child should absolutely still be able to choose that. But if not, for whatever reason, some of that money should follow the child to a private school, a homeschool setting, or a charter school, or some other type of opportunity. And the best way to do that is in the form of an education savings account. The money that would have been allocated to your child to go to their residentially assigned traditional public school, a portion of that would follow the child into an education savings account, which could then be used for all of these other types of government approved education expenditures. And what's interesting here is that we already fund so many other taxpayer funded initiatives like this. And a lot of the people who don't support funding students directly when it comes to K through 12 do support funding students and other families directly when it comes to other goods and services. For example, in education, we have something in higher education, we have the Pell Grant, which is a grant that goes to individual low-income students. And then the students have the choice to choose a public or private university, religious or non-religious university of their choosing. We have the same thing with the GI Bill for veterans, for pre-K programs, with the federal Head Start program and other state-funded pre-K initiatives. In general, the funding goes to the family. The family can choose the public provider of pre-K services if they want, but they can also choose a private provider. And I can keep going on and on and on with examples like this. with food stamps, for example. We don't tell low-income families that they must use their taxpayer funding through food stamps at a residentially assigned government-run grocery store. And I think most people listening in on this call, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, would realize that if we're going to have that funding allocated, it should go to individual people instead of institutions. And with food stamps, the fund, you can take that funding to any provider that you'd like: Walmart, Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, Safeway. I can go on and on and on. Medicaid dollars go to people, and people can choose public or private hospitals of their choosing. Section 8 housing vouchers go to people. Social Security dollars go to people. And I started to think more and more about why there would be this disconnect between supporting the funding directly going to people when it comes to higher education and pre-K, and then to not support it in between years with K through 12. And the only reason that I can come up with as to why there might be this logical inconsistency is that the power dynamics differ. Choice is the norm with higher education and pre-K, but choice threatens an entrenched special interest when it comes to K through 12 education. And so those special interest groups fight really hard against allowing families to take their children's education dollars to another provider. Now, and I'll get to the study in a quick second, but I really want to point out as well that there's the case for school choice is stronger now than it ever has been before, particularly with the public school monopolies' refusal or inability to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. A one-size-fits-all solution isn't going to work for every single individual child because individuals' needs differ, and because there might be a behemoth school system might not be able to adapt in time. Even if it has incentives aligned to do a good job, it might not be able to adapt and respond to changes in the overall community. And then in so many places, including in North Carolina, we've seen a stark contrast in the response from the private sector and the public sector. With private schools and other private businesses, including daycares and restaurants and grocery stores, they've either been open for a long time or they've been fighting really hard against governments to try to reopen for in-person instruction or in-person services. But public schools in so many places, and teachers' unions in particular, have been fighting for the opposite. They've been fighting to remain closed. And I don't think the difference is one of motivations. I don't think that people in the public sector are inherently bad and people in the private sector are inherently good. I think the difference is one of incentives. One of these sectors gets your money regardless of whether they open their doors for business. And so the way to fix this, if you think about it in terms of other services, is to attach the money to the individual. If your grocery store, for example, doesn't reopen, you can take your money elsewhere. If your neighborhood Safeway doesn't reopen, you could take your money to Walmart or Whole Foods or Trader Joe's. If your neighborhood school doesn't reopen, I think families should similarly be able to take their children's education dollars elsewhere. And that would fix a lot of the problems that we're seeing here. And I think families nationwide are seeing this main problem emerge in the K-12 public education system, that we fund institutions rather than individual students, regardless of how well they do. And this year in particular, regardless of whether they even open their doors for business. And 2 nationwide surveys have suggested that this is actually happening, a rise in support for school choice. One by Real Clear Opinion Research found nationwide that support for funding students directly has increased by 10 percentage points just since April, in a few months.
That's a huge increase.
It's huge.
And it's pandemic related, presumably?
Yeah, I mean, if April 2020 to August 2020, the increase went from 67% support to 77% support. And then another national survey from EdChoice similarly found support for every type of school choice: charter schools, tax credit scholarships, voucher programs, education savings accounts have jumped between 2019 and 2020, presumably because of the ineffectiveness or inability of the traditional school system to respond to the needs of families at this time. And to get into the findings of the study that I did in connection with the Reason Foundation and John Locke Foundation, is I reviewed a bunch of the evidence, or the preponderance of the evidence, on various outcomes of school choice initiatives, private school choice initiatives in particular. And if you look at the preponderance of the evidence, it tends to be positive when you look at things like even like standardized test scores, things that parents don't value as much as other outcomes such as safety and culture of the schools. But even when you look at things like standardized test scores, there are 10 random assignment studies linking whether you win a lottery to attend a private school to standardized test score outcomes. And the majority of those 10 find statistically significant positive effects overall or for some subgroups of students, whereas a handful of them find no statistically significant difference at a fraction of the cost. All of these programs tend to be funded at a lot lower amounts than what they spend in the traditional public schools. Take North Carolina's Opportunity Scholarship, for example. The public schools spend between $9,000 and $10,000 per child per year in North Carolina, whereas the Opportunity Scholarship is only funded about 40% of that amount, only about $4,000 per child per year, yet they tend to get better outcomes. If you look at the most recent peer-reviewed study of the Opportunity Scholarship Program by Anna Egalite at NC State and her team, published in 2020 in AERA Open, they found that access to a private school, after controlling for a bunch of different characteristics of the students and their families, they had about a third of a standard deviation increase in math and reading test scores, which is a huge effect size. And 2 of those 17 experimental random assignment studies are also based in North Carolina from studies in Charlotte, North Carolina by Josh Cowan and Jay Green. Both did these studies in the 2000s. And they found that winning a lottery to attend a private school through a scholarship program in Charlotte, North Carolina, increased math and reading test scores by about 6 to 8 percentile points, which is a significant improvement. But linking all of this evidence to achievement outcomes, which can then be linked to lifetime earnings, I estimated that a universal statewide education savings account program in North Carolina would be associated with that. If about 5% of the school-age population used it in the first year, the benefits to those students would accrue to about $19 billion in additional lifetime earnings in North Carolina from getting access to this program. I looked at other outcomes as well, such as educational attainment, which tends to be positive for private school choice initiatives as well. About 8 studies on that topic that are rigorous, and 6 of the 8 find statistically significant positive effects on outcomes like high school graduation or college enrollment. The 2 remaining studies found no statistically significant differences at a fraction of the cost. And if you look at a cautious estimate of what that would do in North Carolina, about a 4% increase in high school graduation rates, that would be associated with about a $790 million increase in economic benefits associated with higher graduation rates from high school. From increased earnings and then reductions in social costs associated with having more graduates in the population. And then there are 6 studies that link school choice, whether through charter schools or private school choice initiatives, to crime. All 6 of these studies are peer-reviewed in academic journals, and all 6 of them find statistically significant reductions of crime associated with access to school choice initiatives. For example, a random assignment evaluation in Harlem's Children's Zone in New York City found that winning a lottery to attend a charter school in that area led to a complete elimination of incarceration for male students and about a 59% reduction in teenage pregnancy for those students. One of these 6 studies is based in North Carolina as well by researchers at Rand. Andrew McEachern and his team have a 2020 peer-reviewed evaluation finding that access to charter schools in North Carolina reduced misdemeanors and felonies by about a third, which obviously has huge benefits to society that expand. It's for a benefit for the student, obviously, but it's a benefit for the rest of society as well. And I estimated that those effects would be about, a cautious estimate would be about a $12 million economic benefit to the rest of society just for the first cohort of students using the program in the first year. I can keep going on and about those findings and specific studies, which we can get to in the Q&A. But in the report, I also go over some school choice myths that the other side will use to try to paint funding students directly as a bad thing when there's no good reasons to fund institutions when you can fund the students directly instead.
And
And
Corey, on
yeah,
that point, I would love it if you would address right off the top here the myth that, well, the pushback that I hear so many times is that if you are pro school choice, that you are automatically anti public school.
nope, that's absolutely incorrect because, as I said earlier, you can still choose your public school. That option should absolutely still be on the table. But the other side likes to point school choice supporters as anti-public school because they know a lot of the population wants to keep their public school, which is an option that should absolutely still be on the table. But the way I like to respond to that in particular is that allowing families to choose their grocery store doesn't mean that you're anti-Safeway. That wouldn't make any sense. And so similarly, allowing people to choose their school is an anti-public school. And a similar claim here that is made along these lines is that if you're for school choice, then you just want to defund the public schools. School choice just defunds the public schools, to which I respond, school choice initiatives don't defund public schools. Public schools without school choice defund families. School choice initiatives just take that money and return it to the hands of the rightful owners, which could then still take it back to the public school if they want, but they could also take it to whatever institution works best for them. You would similarly never hear someone say that, again, allowing families to choose their grocery store defunds Walmart. That wouldn't make any sense because most people understand that grocery money doesn't belong to Walmart. It doesn't belong to Trader Joe's either. It doesn't belong to Whole Foods either. It belongs to the family. And I similarly argue that the funding doesn't belong to the public school system. The funding is supposed to be meant for educating the child, not propping up and protecting a government monopoly. So we should fund the students directly instead of these institutions. We shouldn't fund the private school institutions directly either. We should allow the families to direct that where those education dollars ultimately end up, just like we do with Pell Grants and pre-K programs and food stamps and the GI Bill and Medicaid and Section 8 housing vouchers. All these other programs fund people directly. We should do the same thing when it comes to K through 12 education. But if you look at North Carolina in particular, I believe there was a recent lawsuit started by the Education Association out there, NCAE, I believe, and parents that they got together as well. But a lot of the arguments that they're trying to make is that they're trying to get rid of first of all, they're trying to get rid of the low end, the North Carolina Opportunity Scholarship, which is targeted to low income students, which allows low income families to access private schools of their choosing, which is an equalizer because, as we all know, advantaged families already have school choice. They can already afford to pay for private school tuition and fees out of pocket. They can already afford to move to the neighborhoods that tend to be residentially assigned to the higher quality public schools. So school choice, including the Opportunity Scholarship Program, is an equalizer by allowing more families to have those options as well. But the other side will argue it's unconstitutional because you're defunding the public schools, which isn't a constitutionality argument. It's an argument that, hey, I'm trying to protect my monopoly. I don't want you to be able to take any money elsewhere, even though families are voluntarily opting out and only getting about 40% of the funding that they would have gotten in the public schools, which tells you that the public schools actually financially benefit when they lose students to this program on a per pupil basis. Just imagine if you left Walmart and started shopping at Trader Joe's and Walmart got to keep half of your funding, half of your grocery funding. They'd be happy about that. But okay, yeah, you should leave probably because we get to keep your money for no longer having to provide you with goods and services. That would be a great deal for Walmart. I similarly argue that the public schools should be happy they get to keep any money at all for students that are no longer educating. And then also, just to get back on that main point of you're defunding the public schools, what does that tell you about the defenders of the status quo? What do they feel will happen when families are given the choice to leave? You're only going to lose any funding at all if families voluntarily select to opt out of your institution. So they're essentially implicitly admitting that they believe that they are not providing families with a satisfactory educational setting.
And that in and of itself is really a sad commentary right there, because you would think that obviously, if a family is satisfied, no matter what environment or format it is, they're going to stick with it if it's working for their child. And to have a default position that somehow everybody's going to leave really says you don't have confidence in your own product, your own service.
Yeah, their main argument is really a great argument for school choice, not against it. They're telling on themselves essentially when they make this argument that they believe that they're not doing a good job. And let's face it, I mean, these kinds of arguments are leading to inequities because they're only preventing the least advantaged from choosing alternatives. The most advantaged are still able to choose these alternatives regardless of whether they get a voucher or the funding to be able to send their children to the other institutions. But another argument that they make as to why it's not constitutional is they'll say, oh, well, this isn't providing this program isn't providing a public benefit, to which I'll respond, well, what about the public schools that are failing to educate thousands and thousands of students each year? Are you calling to defund those schools too? Probably not. And the real public benefit here isn't propping up an institution. It's allowing a child to get a satisfactory and adequate education. And the best way to do that is to allow them to choose the schools that work best for their particular environment and setup. And then there's one more argument that they make is that this is probably their strongest constitutional argument, but it's still not any good. At least it's on the topic of constitutionality. Is they'll argue that this is an issue with the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, that this is a separation of church and state issue because, well, you can use the funding that are public dollars at private religious institutions. But my response to that is, one, there's Supreme Court precedent showing that this is constitutional. You look at this Zellman versus Simmons-Harris case from 2002, ruled in favor of families. And the reason for that is that families are the primary beneficiary, not the school. And the funding goes to individual families who can then choose. You can go to the public school if you want. That is non-sectarian. You can go to a private school, it's non-sectarian. Or you can go to a private religious school if you want. Because the decision is in the hands of the families, there is separation there. And then it's the same reason why Pell Grants are not unconstitutional as far as the Establishment Clause goes, because the money doesn't go directly from the government to the religious schools. The money is directed by the decision of the student. You can use the funding for religious private schools. The same thing with pre-K programs. You can use the funding for religiously affiliated pre-K institutions, but you don't see people attacking the teachers union, attacking the higher education programs or the pre-K programs, again, because the power dynamics differ. These other levels of education and allowing people to choose don't threaten their monopoly. That only occurs at the K through 12 education level. And
Corey,
similarly, yeah, go ahead.
Corey, you've covered a lot of ground here, so why don't we bring in Bob and Terry back to the conversation here and talk a little bit deeper about some of the things that you've mentioned here and get their perspective as well. I want to remind everybody that Corey is the author of this recent study on North Carolina, funding students instead of systems, the economic impacts of statewide education savings accounts in North Carolina. And my colleague Brene has posted in the comments section of the Facebook page a link to the study. So if you want to dig deeper into all of these issues that Corey has been talking about, that is the place to go in order to do that. All right, let's welcome back Dr. Bob Lubke and Dr. Terry Stoops, both of the Center for Effective Education here at the John Locke Foundation. Gentlemen, welcome into this conversation. Terry, I'd like to start with you and just get your general reaction. You've been listening to Corey, you've read this study, and of course, you and Bob are both experts in the field. Tell me what really jumps out at you about what Corey's been talking about.
Well, thank you, Donna, and thank you so much, Corey, for joining us on this National School Choice Week. The one transformation that ESAs bring to the table is that they allow parents really to customize the education of their children. For years, the school choice community has been backing vouchers and tax credits where the entire amount would go to the school, and that would cover the tuition and fees for the particular school. But the education savings account is a different way of thinking. It provides the ability for parents to customize the education of their children, so they can use a portion of the funding for tuition and fees. They could use other portions of the funding for school technology, for therapy, for any number of needs that they identify for their children. And this is an extremely powerful way of making sure that children receive all of the services and not just the educational services they need to be successful.
It's so
And so
personalized.
that's right. That's right. And we personalize everything in our life these days. Everything is personalized. And so education should be no different. And that is really the change in thinking that we have with ESAs. And let me just shift very quickly about other changes that we've seen with COVID with regard to school choice, that parents that never thought they would need school choice are now realizing that they desperately do. And these are middle and upper income families that, as Corey said, have settled in neighborhoods that have excellent schools. They never thought that they would need to think about school choice. And then they saw their school buildings close, and much to their dismay, a teachers association fight hard against the reopening. And not only did they realize that teachers weren't in their corner and school boards weren't in their corner, but they realized that the system was not set up to provide them choices to be able to send their child to a school to wait out the COVID pandemic. And this is really the transformational moment that we see ourselves in the school choice movement, is that parents that never thought that they would need school choice and always thought that the teachers were in their corner and had their best interests at heart, suddenly it's been revealed to them that no, that is not the case. The teachers are thinking about themselves, and they're thinking about what they want for their schools to be, and not thinking about what is in the best interest of children. So many transformations, many things for us to think about here in this National School Choice Week.
Bob, interesting. Terry's using the word transformation. Corey used the word equalizer. I think they're both really important terms there. Tell us what jumps out at you. Of course, you were working with Corey on the development of this paper.
Yes, I'd echo Corey and Terry's comments on that. And I think they were both well stated and really brought together a lot of the high points that needed to be reiterated as far as the advantages of an ESA. And one thing I just wanted to share was we've kind of camped on the advantages of an ESA to individuals, and how it can particularly meet the unique needs of a period now with COVID, and how it can be a really good tool for addressing the specific needs of kids, especially minority kids, which have been left behind because of the inability or the unwillingness of systems to be able to address those needs. What kind of stood out to me as we talked about this, and even as I reread it, is just the literature, and it's growing even as we speak, about the social impacts, the beneficial social impacts of an ESA. And Corey had mentioned a lot of those: crime reduction, higher educational attainment, better civic outcomes, just a lot of social benefits that a lot of times we don't necessarily talk about when we're focused on school choice, because we're talking about the needs of the individual students and families, which are important. But we also need to talk about when we consider these options, there is a significant social benefit that has been researched, it has been articulated, and we need to consider that as part of the whole discussion, that there's not only individual benefits, but there are significant and real social benefits. So choice I view it as, it not only transforms families, but communities as well. And we've talked about this. We've had, Bart Danielson on previous Shaftesbury's, when Bart's talked about, how charter schools can help transform communities. And so that's a part of this whole discussion, I think, that needs to also be brought in on the social aspects, and talk about them also with, obviously the advantages of an ESAs to individual families.
That's such an important point. And by the way, let me point out to all of you who are watching us here that Corey has actually posted in the comments section of our Facebook page an op-ed that he wrote with Bob that was published in the Washington Examiner, funding students rather than institutions. So that's another resource for you there to dig into this information more. That, of course, that op-ed based on the study that Corey has been talking about here. Gentlemen, I thought it was really fascinating. One thing that Corey mentioned was the higher likelihood. I'm not a statistician, so I'll put it this way. The higher likelihood of someone graduating from high school and due to choice, and what the impact would be on their life, on their family, on the broader community, as Bob points out. And that, to me, seems like something that we should be discussing a whole lot more. What say you?
Yeah, totally. I mean, a lot of the times the short-term outcomes like standardized test scores do not predict these longer-term outcomes, such as higher likelihoods of graduating from high school and enrolling in college. And then even within the same years, there are disconnects between test score outcomes and other outcomes. For example, the latest federal evaluation of the DC voucher program where I live, first of all, the DC voucher kids only get about a third of what they spend in the public schools. In DC, they spend over $31,000 per child per year. It's pretty crazy here. But the latest gold standard evaluation found that after 3 years of using the program, the students who won the lottery, there's no effect on math or reading test scores at a third of the cost. But the students were much more likely to report that they're in a very safe school, and they're also more likely to report that they were satisfied with their overall educational experience, and they're more likely to show up each day too. As it turns out, if you feel like you're safe at school, you're more likely to actually show up to class each day. I think looking at the whole picture is really important here, not just test scores and not just even attainment outcomes, but all of these things are really important for life success and long-term outcomes. And if you look at the safety literature on this, which I include in the study, that I don't kind of monetize to economic benefits, but I still mention them anyway. I did a peer-reviewed review of this literature with Jude Schwalbach, who's at the Heritage Foundation, in a journal called Educational Review. And we found all 11 studies that exist on the topic find that private schools generally have safer environments than their nearby public schools, even after controlling for differences in student populations. And then also there are about 30 studies that EdChoice has reported on in their 1, 2, 3s of school choice that look at satisfaction outcomes. And I think every single one of those studies, except for maybe one, finds better satisfaction outcomes for students. And I think that's the ultimate metric of success. Is the family satisfied with the product? Because that encompasses a whole wide range of outcomes, not just one thing like standardized test scores.
Terry, Corey also mentioned in his presentation the pushback, and specifically legal pushback, to opportunity scholarships for low-income families here in North Carolina. What is going on with that? Number one, what is the motivation, Terry, and what's the status?
Well, we're still waiting for the courts to begin having hearings on the case itself. And so here at the John Locke Foundation, we'll keep you updated on the latest that we hear about that case. The motivation is to try to eliminate a program that competes directly with the schools that the Teachers Association and Teachers Union embrace, and they don't want the competition. The irony of the lawsuit, of course, is that they're suing to try to put an end to the opportunity scholarship, but they refuse to file a lawsuit to oppose our special needs education savings account or our disability grant. And so this is really targeting low-income children. And it shows just how much they fear the popularity of this program. They fear the fact that these students and more families are embracing private school choice, that they're happy in these schools, and they're telling their friends that here is a program, the Opportunity Scholarship Program, that could really benefit their children. We've had an interview with Janet Nunn, a fantastic parent who has her granddaughter in a private school in Charlotte, talk about just how much this program has benefited her child, that her child wasn't reading at grade level, wasn't engaged in class, and now her child is a leader in the school. And the reason why that happened, the reason why that transformation happened, was because someone told Janet Nunn about the Opportunity Scholarship Program, and she took a leap of faith, got a voucher for her grandchild, and allowed her grandchild to go to a private school and where she's thriving. These are the stories that the teachers union doesn't want people to hear, because if more parents hear about that kind of a benefit, if they hear that this small program that is only a fraction of the North Carolina education budget, that enrolls just a few thousand children, can have that kind of effect on a child, then they're going to want to have the same. So this is an attempt to try to snuff out the school choice movement in North Carolina. And I think that they're going to be unsuccessful in doing so. And to be completely honest and to be blunt about it, we'll fight like hell to make sure that that's the case.
Well, as we try to work our way out of this pandemic, it would seem to me that those types of choices, and in particular, those kids who are maybe living in families where both parents are maybe trying to work, go ahead and earn a living, and so you may have kind of a question mark around the veracity of how much the child is being supervised at home in an online learning environment situation. In other words, they might be even more vulnerable coming out of the pandemic, vulnerable to this learning loss, Terry, that you have been writing so much about. It seems to me that something like the Opportunity Scholarship or many other forms of choice could really be the hope that a parent is looking for as we all kind of struggle to figure out what's happened with our child during this online learning, and what do we do moving out? How can we make up any losses?
And I think that's a critical point, because as a state, we haven't really tested many of our students, so we don't know what learning loss looks like. But based on research done outside of North Carolina and even internationally, we know that those who are going to be hardest hit with learning loss are those that can least afford it. These are low income and special needs students. And so it seems logical for the state to begin thinking about ways to handle the remediation of these children. And one way to do that is to provide parents a tool in the form of an education savings account to provide the tutoring and supplemental education services that their child needs in order to catch up. This is an absolutely critical time to start thinking about it, especially when you realize that the state really doesn't have a plan right now for dealing with the remediation of students who have fallen behind, who have experienced learning loss from essentially almost a year of online learning. When you recognize that the state Department of Public Instruction, State Board of Education have yet to put forth a plan to ensure that all of our students are meeting grade level in reading and math and all the other subjects that they have, then you realize that there's going to be a desperate yearning for some sort of school choice program that would allow the students to get the kind of services that they need. And I think this is an opportune time with the state legislature coming back into session that they start considering all the options. And I really think that the strongest option is an education savings account for those kids that have fallen behind. Because if we don't do something for them immediately, then it means that we're waiting 1 or 2 more years in order to have a program implemented that in the end will probably do very little for their children and the children that have fallen behind. And so I think it's incumbent on our legislators to get a program passed and implemented for the coming school year to make sure that every parent has that option available.
You know, Bob, we're getting some interesting comments here in on our Facebook page as you all are talking about this. One, Ellen posting, speaking to me directly right here. We've got some others saying, you know, we need choice now more than ever. Bob, Terry mentioned, you know, that this is a time with the legislature coming back into session in earnest in a few days here. Bob, do you anticipate that there will be bipartisan, maybe more open-mindedness perhaps to more personalized instruction because of COVID-19? And every legislator, you know, when they're at home, they may have a child themselves, or they've got family, or they've got neighbors who are kind of bending their ears saying, I need help. My child hopefully is doing well, but a lot of kids are not. So is it a time? Is this really the opportunity?
Yeah, I think so, Donna. Everyone's living through this. This isn't something that some families not affected by. You live it, you see it, families that are deeply impacted by it. And I think legislators on both sides of the aisle want to solve it. I am optimistic that I think people's antenna are on this. How do we do this so that families can be served? And I'm cautiously optimistic that we can work together on this. Now, I personally think, and we've been talking about ESAs here since 2012. I think this is really the best solution to it. Can we craft one that can be acceptable, to all people, all legislators on different parts of the issue? That's not my decision, but we're really going to try. I would like to, bring before legislators, options that have already been tried. Like, for example, in Florida, there's a reading scholarship down there that was introduced a couple of years ago. I think it was provided a modest amount, about $500 or so, but it went to families and it was targeted on kids that were a little farther behind. The parents had the options to be able to use that money to help get their child back up to speed, whether it be for classes, tutoring, whatever, testing. And it's proven very popular. I think something like that should be doable here. I think we're also in an environment where we've seen that DPI has not spent a lot of the money properly as far as programs that were supposed to address some of these needs in the last year. So I think the environment is right. There's a little window here, and I think we need to capitalize on it. And I hope it's just getting the right people in the room with the right incentives and come up with something that serves all families.
Corey, I'd like to talk a little bit more, if we could, about the acceptance of choice among the minority community and the achievement that is occurring. Terry actually provided me with some information about the statewide charter school membership by race and sex here in North Carolina. And I was looking at the numbers, Corey, and I would say, if my math is right here, it's about 39, pushing 40% of the membership is minority, either Black or Hispanic, boys and girls. So it seems to me that at least with public charter schools here in North Carolina, that choice option is popular with minority parents and kids.
Yeah, if you consistently look at the surveys on this, minorities are actually more likely to support initiatives, school choice initiatives, than white people overall. And if you look at the charter school population in the United States, actually tends to be a higher percentage of minority students than in the traditional schools, and a higher percentage of low-income students nationwide in charter schools than in traditional public schools. Something I wanted to point out, though, is, there was a lot of crazy stuff that went on this past year as far as schools not opening their doors, a lot of protests, and to not go back to work in person all across the nation. We had teachers unions banding together with the Democratic Socialists of America to protest reopening schools and to list several political demands, including banning their competition. But there was also something that I thought was really interesting that happened in North Carolina and in other districts across the nation. One of the most ridiculous things was that there were certain school districts saying that it wasn't safe enough to open schools for in-person instruction, but it was safe enough to open those same school buildings for in-person childcare activities. Right. Which begs the question, well, why is it okay to do daycare in the same buildings, but then once learning is introduced, it becomes a problem? So I started to look a little further into this, and I started to see the reason as to why families were being charged out of pocket in addition to what they were already paying to the property tax system, and as to why you could reopen those same buildings for childcare but not learning. And it turned out in a lot of these places, the public school teachers were continuing to get paid through the property tax system, but they weren't going into the school buildings. They were teaching virtually from their homes. But then you had people from the private sector coming from places like the YMCA into the school buildings to replace them. And then to get the funding for that, parents had to pay out of pocket. So that's great for all the employees. The public sector and private sector employees got to benefit from that. But the people who are missing out are the individual families. They still had to pay through the property tax system, just like they did any other year. But then they started having to reach into their pockets to essentially pay twice for a service that they would have gotten any other year, because one group of employees understood that they can continue to get paid regardless of where they did that job. And so rationally, they decided to stay home. That doesn't mean that they were bad people or had any ill intentions, but this really shows on full display the messed up set of incentives that we have baked into the K-12 public school system. And the main problem here is the uneven power dynamic between the monopoly and individual families. The way to fix that power dynamic is to have the money follow the child to wherever they're getting an education, so that you can have some sort of feedback mechanism from the bottom up for the individual schools that make good or bad decisions for individual families. And then there'll be a better responsiveness. And another strand of literature that I cite in the study is there's a whole bunch of evidence, about 28 studies on the competitive effects of private school choice programs on the outcomes in the traditional public schools. 26 of those 28 studies find statistically significant positive effects of school choice competition on the children who don't even use the program. So in that sense, school choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats through these competitive pressures. And so this is really a win-win for everyone. And there's also 5 studies that I know of that look at these same competitive effects of private school choice or charter schools on the teacher salaries in the public schools. Those 5 studies all find evidence to suggest that public school salaries actually go up for the teachers in the public schools as a response to that competition. That's because the public schools start to allocate their resources more efficiently. It starts to go less towards administrative bloat and staffing surges, and it starts to go more towards the classroom and to the individual teachers. So in that sense, school choice benefits teachers too.
Terry, if you would, talk a little bit more about this data that you provided to me, showing this nearly 4 out of 10 of the kids who are in public charter schools for the 2020-21 year here in our state are either Black or Hispanic kids. Why is that so an option that minority parents are taking up?
Well, I think, and when you look at the statewide data, of course, it varies school by school. And you see that if you look at the demographics of individual schools, sometimes there are schools that are predominantly African American, and that's great. These are schools that specifically have in their mission statement the outreach to African American communities and the emphasis and study of African American culture. I have a friend, Marcus Brandon, that calls them basically HBCUs on the K-12 level. And that's exactly right. If we accept the fact that we have institutions of higher education that focus on the needs of African-American communities, we should have charter schools and public schools that do the exact same thing. And we do have that in North Carolina. One group that the charter school community has had difficulty reaching out to is the Hispanic community, and that's really the one demographic that the charter school community falls short on when it comes to recruiting parents. Now, that's been changing in recent years as charter schools in North Carolina start to move into areas where there's a high concentration of Hispanic families. And one of the triumphs of North Carolina's charter school community, and we have 199 schools enrolling about 125,000 children, is that they are starting to find communities where not only is there a demand for charter schools, but we have viable charter schools that are being created by members of those communities in places that may not have a charter school within 50 or 100 miles. This is a really great development, because when charter schools came online in the mid-90s, the issue and the concern of many was that charter schools would basically locate in urban and suburban communities and would skim the best students from the public school system, when in reality that hasn't happened at all. We have charter schools that have focused their mission on the most needy students. We have charter schools that are located in low-income areas, in rural communities, in urban communities, and suburban communities. So we have a rich, diverse charter school movement in North Carolina, one that I'm really happy to be a part of. I'm a co-founder of a charter school in a rural community near a largely Hispanic area in Andrew, North Carolina. I serve on the Charter School Advisory Board. And so in those capacities, I'm seeing charter schools do a tremendous amount of good, reaching communities that they had never reached before and creating educational opportunities where they didn't exist. And so the idea that charter schools are somehow harming their fellow district schools, and remember, charter schools are public schools, just like district schools are. The idea that they're harming them is absolutely patently false. We have student data that tells us that not only are students performing well academically, but their non-academic outcomes are absolutely outstanding. And remember, and let me just give a quick history lesson. The reason why there was such a movement to found public schools in the 19th century wasn't based on test scores. We didn't get that until the 20th century. It was based on the idea that public schools need to do more to ensure that they mitigate crime and they provide rich opportunities to create engaged citizenry. And those were the two reasons why there was such a movement to found public schools in the 19th century. And so those are worthwhile goals in and of themselves, let alone the idea that they should raise student achievement, which they unquestionably have done in North Carolina.
Bob, we also have seen an absolute surge in homeschooling here in North Carolina. Our state is one of the leaders in homeschooling. What is the appeal of homeschooling? And secondly, and Corey, you might want to jump in on this as well. How would an education savings account impact a parent who is homeschooling? Bob, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, I think we all know part of the reason of why the potential homeschooling families crashed the agency website last July is that, I mean, I think it's indicative of a lot of the frustration that families were feeling with, virtual learning, not feeling that their kids were where they needed to be, being dissatisfied with a lot of the changes that were, were a result of COVID, et cetera. So I think dissatisfactions fueled a lot of that, and it continues to fuel it. Also, there was public sentiment that when people saw, close up, some of the lessons that were being taught, how they were being taught, parents got more involved. They saw, I think I could do some of this. I might be able to do a better job. Or they saw some of the content. They didn't necessarily like the content. They felt they could be more academically rigorous or a tweak here or there. So I think when parents got a little bit behind the curtain, so to speak, on some of that, I think they, some light bulbs went off. Some people decided to go further down the path of homeschooling. I think that might have jogged some other options as far as other educational opportunities, et cetera. But I think overall, we'd expect the homeschooling enrollment to probably jump about maybe 10 to 12% in the next year. I mean, based on what we've been hearing, et cetera. And as far as, options, as far as how an ESA might be able to help, I mean, there are a number of proposals that have been put forth right now that would include homeschoolers as far as families, that could use that money for curriculum, other educational services like tutoring, testing, et cetera. And I think that would be great. So they should be part of, all families being able to access all educational options, homeschooling being one of them. right now, I think if my memory doesn't fail me, I think there's about 142,000 kids in that are homeschooling throughout North Carolina. That's a lot. In fact, the number in private school, I think, is a little over 100,000. So, in the increases the last few years have been significant. So, I mean, if you look at, I mean, that's a lot. I mean, if you put that in real terms, I think it would, that would be the total enrollments of Wake County. I think also, let me back off on that a little bit. I think the numbers are eluding me a little bit on that, but the point is, it's 142,000 students, and it's been growing rapidly. We really need to address some of their needs. What do they need as far as options, as far as help in the way of finances and so forth. Also, the whole idea of learning pods, and those are whole new avenues of instruction that have been gearing up in the last year or two. I think the legislature will probably need to look at options and how they can help families, to kind of navigate their way through COVID.
Corey, what would an education savings account, from your perspective, mean to a parent who is already making a choice outside of a traditional public school? What would change for them?
Well, it'll make it more economically feasible. Some of these families who are, doing private schooling or doing homeschooling, they may be forced to go back into the public system if they don't have the funding to cover for these alternatives for additional years. So it could make it or break it for particular individual families. But yes, I think Bob hit the nail on the head that the education savings account funding could be used for a whole host of different types of education expenditures, including the tutoring, textbooks, micro schools, pandemic pods. And for listeners, the whole micro school pandemic pod thing is you essentially get 5 to 10 students together in a household. It's pretty much like a one-room schoolhouse or a miniature school where families can economize on the task of homeschooling by banding together. And let's say you use the ESA to cover that. The teachers could, you could hire a teacher that could get a lot of those revenues and create additional jobs that way. But then it'll just make it more economically feasible if you band together 5 to 10 students in a household. I will say some homeschool families, they might have issues with education savings accounts, and some homeschool groups have opposed them. Some have supported them as well. But the argument goes that if an education savings account is quote unquote public money or taxpayer money, that could lead to additional regulations. But my first response there is, well, it's not going to be as regulated as the government-run school. 2, ESAs tend to be a lot less regulated than any other form of private school choice initiatives, just what we've seen in different states historically. And then 3, it's voluntary every step of the way. Each individual family can choose whether to accept the ESA funding or not. If the regulatory burden is too high, given the benefits of being able to cover the cost of home-based education, each individual family can make that cost-benefit decision themselves, and no homeschool family is forced to take any homeschooling funds through the education savings account whatsoever. So that's my quick response to that. But I do think Bob is right as well, that one of the silver linings here through remote learning is that families got to see what was going on in the classroom. A lot of it had to do with, well, they weren't teaching that well, but other families were seeing that there was a lot of political indoctrination in their view going on in the classroom. And that's another argument. It's a whole another argument for school choice, which a lot of it's about what I talked about in my study with academic achievement, better academic outcomes. But a lot of it's about what's being taught and how things are being taught. And if you feel like your child is being indoctrinated in the public school system, you shouldn't have to pay for that. And you shouldn't be forced to send your child to a school that is teaching your child a worldview that you wholeheartedly disagree with. And so that's another avenue as to why school choice is important as well.
As our time today comes to a close, Bob, I'd like to, and Terry, go to both of you and get a final thought. Bob, what is your hope for education savings accounts and the impact on a North Carolina parent who's listening to us right now?
Well, I'm optimistic. I think anybody who's lived through the last year has learned a lot, about what works, what doesn't work, and we're kind of in a window of opportunity here. We see that we're being ill-served by a system that has not been able or been willing or able to respond to the differing needs of students. Okay, they've fallen behind. All groups have fallen behind. We've been thrown into a virtual learning system that no one likes, that's ineffective, et cetera. And parents are basically have become teachers. They're tearing their hair out. They're saying, this doesn't work. What does? ESAs can provide a real solution for a lot of those people. They are customizable. They basically allow parents to specifically address the needs of their child, to put them in the best learning environment, the environment that's best for them. And oftentimes now, if you're looking at this, from a million different perspectives, Corey had laid out all the research behind it, many social benefits to it. I also think, if we look at a broader perspective on this, I'm optimistic because I think we've won the argument on choice. Okay, parents want it. They see the opportunities, they see the research, they see what their kids need. It's being able to put it in a policy form that's acceptable to everyone. Now, we've got an environment here where we have Republican majorities that are very pro-school choice. We've got a governor who's very anti-school choice, and we have a very vocal teachers union who's doing a lot to end choice. But we've got a public that's witnessing all this and wants other educational options. ESAs are a great vehicle to solve a lot of those problems. And it's our job to convince lawmakers that we need to do that now.
Terry, your hope for ESAs and funding students rather than systems?
I think parents need to speak out, and it's past time for them to speak out, and not only to talk publicly about what their experiences were through COVID, but to talk about how the needs of their children weren't being met. There is an army of lobbyists that descend on the legislative building, trying to convince legislators that district schools are underfunded, under siege, that they're really meeting the needs of their parents, and that this outcry for school choice is nothing but a fringe movement and propaganda, when in reality is that parents want school choice and they need to reach out to their lawmakers and talk about their experiences. They don't have to get behind any one policy or another, but they have to let their lawmakers know what their experiences have been and what their needs are. Because for too long, I think a lot of parents have let other people speak for them, whether that was they thought that the teachers would speak for them, that administrators, that school boards would speak for them, only to find that through COVID, none of those groups were speaking for them, representing their needs, talking to lawmakers about creating a system that really attends to the needs of their children. And so I think it's time for parents to speak up. And I'm encouraged to see parents in Wake County and Mecklenburg County speak up aggressively against the school board, the teachers, and those who are really working in ways that are contrary to the needs of their children. I think we're seeing a real movement here in North Carolina, led by ordinary parents that are championing school choice, recognizing that school choice not only benefits the low income and special needs students that we have created school choice programs for, but benefit all children in North Carolina.
Terry Stoops, Bob Lubke, and Corey Deangelis of the Reason Foundation. Gentlemen, it's been a really fascinating hour. Thank you so much for joining us here on this Monday of National School Choice Week. And folks, want to remind you as well that Corey has been posting in the comments section of the John Locke Foundation Facebook page. You could go there, access all sorts of information, including the fundamental report that we have been talking about Funding students instead of systems explains to you exactly what the education savings account is, how it would impact North Carolina in all sorts of different ways that we've been talking about today. That's a really important report. And so if you are interested in this, if you know people who are interested in looking at other options for their kids or their grandkids, that is it's a short paper, but it is jam-packed with all sorts of information. They'll want to take a few minutes to read that. You know, Terry said something interesting a moment ago. He's talking about, you know, speaking out and having a voice, and parents need to talk and tell their lawmakers exactly what their experience has been. Couldn't agree more. And I just want to assure you that here at the John Locke Foundation, that's our mission, to be your voice. School choice, empowering you, trying to make sure you have an option for a more personalized education for your child that works for your child. That's one of our core mission areas here at the John Locke Foundation, and we are proud to be champions of giving parents more options. Now, if you like what we do, bringing you forums like this, working with lawmakers, doing all sorts of things, including journalism, our Carolina Journal arm, which, by the way, if you aren't checking in 2 or 3 times a day at carolinajournal.com, you're missing out. I would encourage you to do that. We want you to know that we would appreciate so much if you would like to help fund everything that we're doing here at the John Locke Foundation. It's really simple, really quick. Just go to johnlocke.org. In the upper right-hand corner, just hit the Donate tab. It's a secure portal. It'll take you less than 2 minutes, and we would greatly appreciate any financial support that you would offer to us to help do all of this work to be your voice. On behalf of the entire team here at the John Locke Foundation, I'm Donna Martinez. So glad you joined us today. Have a good National School Choice Week. We'll see you back here for Shaftesbury Society next Monday. Have a good afternoon.